when a Kansas farmer offered his campfire to a wounded stranger during a blizzard. He had no idea he was about to discover a 30-year-old family debt of honor that would change everything. By sunrise, he was surrounded by tribal elders singing ancient songs in his honor, but that was just the beginning of an incredible story of courage, conspiracy, and brotherhood that would test everything he believed about family and friendship. Make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more amazing frontier stories, and ring that notification bell, because this tale of the Old West will restore your faith in the power of human kindness. The November wind cut across the Kansas plains like a cavalry saber, carrying with it the promise of the season's first serious snowfall. Benjamin Carter pulled his wool coat tighter as he made his final rounds of the day, checking the fence lines around his modest wheat farm. At 38, he'd learned to read the prairie weather like scripture, and tonight's sky spoke of trouble coming. Ben had been working this land for 12 years, ever since he'd mustered out of the Union Army and used his veteran settlement money to buy 160 acres of what most folks called the middle of nowhere. His wife Sarah had loved it here, said the endless sky reminded her of God's infinite mercy. She'd been gone 2 winters now, taken by pneumonia, leaving Ben to work the land alone, and wonder sometimes why he bothered Dot as he latched the gate on. The last pasture, the first snowflakes began to fall, not the gentle, lazy flakes of an easy snow, but the hard, driven crystals that meant business. Ben's 2 milk cows were already huddled against the barn, and his chickens had vanished into their co-op hours ago. Even the animals knew what was coming. He was halfway back to his small farmhouse when he heard it. A low moan carried on the wind, almost human, but not quite. Ben stopped, listening hard over the howl of the approaching storm. There it was again, coming from the direction of the creek that marked his property's eastern boundary. Most sensible men would have hurried inside and left whatever was out there to fend for itself. The temperature was dropping fast, and being caught in a prairie blizzard was a death sentence. But Ben had been raised by a Methodist minister who preached that charity began with the stranger at your door, and 12 years of solitary farming hadn't entirely worn away that teaching. He grabbed a lantern from the barn and fought his way through the strengthening wind toward the sound. The snow was coming harder now, stinging his face and making it difficult to see more than a few yards ahead. He followed the creek bank, calling out over the storm. "Hello, anybody out there?" The answer came as another moan, closer this time. Ben raised his lantern and nearly stumbled over the figure huddled against a fallen cottonwood tree. It was a young man, maybe 20 years old, dressed in traditional Lakota clothing, but soaked through and shivering violently. Blood had frozen dark on his forehead, and his left arm hung at an unnatural angle. "Jesus," Ben breathed, setting down the lantern and kneeling beside the injured man. "How long you been out here?" The young man's eyes fluttered open, dark brown and filled with pain, but alert. He tried to speak, but his lips were blue with cold, and the words came out as barely a whisper. "Easy there," Ben said, shrugging off his heavy coat and wrapping it around the stranger's shoulders. "Don't try to talk. We need to get you inside before this storm gets worse." The young man was taller than Ben, but thin, and the farmer managed to get him upright with some effort. Together, they stumbled through the driving snow toward the warm glow of Ben's farmhouse windows. By the time they reached the porch, both men were breathing hard and covered in white dot inside. Ben settled his unexpected guest in the chair closest to the fireplace and quickly built up the fire until it was roaring. The young man was still conscious, but barely, his teeth chattering so hard Ben worried he might bite his tongue. "Let's get you out of these wet clothes," Ben said practically, helping the stranger out of his soaked shirt and leggings. The injured arm was definitely broken, and there were other cuts and bruises that suggested a bad fall, probably from a horse. Ben wrapped the young man in every blanket he owned and set a pot of coffee on the stove. Sarah had always said hot. Coffee could cure most anything short of death itself, and Ben had learned not to argue with her wisdom. As warmth slowly returned to the stranger's body, he began to speak in what Ben recognized as Lakota, though he didn't understand the words. The young man seemed to be trying to explain something, gesturing with his good arm toward the door. "Take it easy," Ben said, offering him a cup of hot coffee. "You're safe here. Storm's getting worse, but we'll ride it out together." The young man accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping both hands around the warm cup. When he spoke again, it was in careful English with a slight accent. "I am grateful you did not have to ... course, I did," Ben said simply. "Can't leave. A man to freeze, no matter who he is or where he comes from." "My name is Joseph," the young man said. "Joseph Crowfeather. Ben Carter. This is my farm." He gestured around the modest but comfortable room. "What happened to you out there?" Joseph's face darkened. "Horse spooked at a rattlesnake, even in the cold. Threw me hard against rocks by the creek. I think my arm ... It's broken," Ben confirmed. "I've set a few bones in my time. We'll need to tend to that. But first, let's get some food in you." As Ben prepared a simple meal of beans and cornbread, he found himself studying his guest. Joseph Crowfeather carried himself with quiet dignity despite his injuries, and there was an intelligence in his eyes that reminded Ben of the few educated Indians he'd encountered during his army days. Most of the white farmers in this area would have been suspicious of finding a Lakota on their property, especially alone and at night. There had been tensions between the local tribes and settlers for years, but Ben had learned during the war that courage and character weren't limited by the color of a man's skin or the language he spoke. He'd served alongside soldiers of every background and knew that honor was honor, regardless of where you found it. "You live around here?" Ben asked as they ate. "My people have a settlement about 20 miles north," Joseph replied. "We were returning from trading in Abilene when the storm caught us. The others made it to shelter, but my horse ... Well, you're sheltered now. Storm like this might last a day or two, but you're welcome to stay as long as needed." Joseph looked at him with surprise. "You would do this? Even though I am ... Even though you're what? A human being who needed help?" Ben's voice was matter-of-fact. "My wife always said the good Lord puts people in our path for a reason. Maybe he figured I needed the company." As the wind howled around the farmhouse and snow piled against the windows, the two men settled into comfortable conversation. Joseph, it turned out, had been educated at a mission school and spoke 3 languages. He served as a translator and negotiator for his band, helping them navigate the increasingly complex relationships with white authorities and settlers. "You are not what I expected," Joseph said as Ben carefully set and splinted his broken arm using strips of cloth and wooden slats. "What did you expect? Most white farmers in this area. They do not trust my people. Some have reason, some do not, but trust is rare between us." Ben finished tying off the splint and sat back. "My daddy always told me that trust has to start somewhere. Might as well start with me." Outside, the storm reached its full fury, rattling the windows and piling snow against the door. But inside, warmed by fire and unexpected fellowship, both men felt something they hadn't experienced in a long time: the simple comfort of not being alone. "Ben Carter," Joseph said as they prepared to sleep, Ben offering his bed while he took the floor by the fire. "I will not forget this kindness." "No need to remember it special," Ben replied, settling into his bedroll. "Just what neighbors do for each other." But as he lay listening to the storm and the quiet breathing of his guest, Ben had the strangest feeling that this night would be remembered for longer than he could imagine. and by more people than just the two of them. Before the first light of dawn crept over the endless, snow-blanketed prairie, Ben Carter was already awake, his mind turning with the weight of another hard winter and the ghosts of stories his father once told. The storm had passed, leaving the land silent and sacred, the kind of hush that made a man feel both small and infinite. In the flickering firelight, Joseph, his unexpected guest, an older Lakota man with a splinted arm, sat quietly, testing the limits of his injury. Ben, a solitary rancher with a past marked by loss and the hard lessons of the frontier, poured 2 cups of coffee and checked his meager supplies. They'd need to dig out, and the work would be unforgiving, but there was something in the air, a sense that the day would bring more than just chores. Breakfast was simple: stale bread, beans, and the kind of conversation that circled around secrets. Joseph finally asked the question that had been burning in his eyes. Was Ben the son of Thomas Carter? The answer unlocked a story. Ben had never heard how his father, decades ago, had saved Joseph's grandfather, Walking Bear, from certain death at the hands of men who thought killing Indians was sport. Thomas Carter, a man of principle, had risked everything to help a stranger, and that act had become legend around Lakota fires. Now, Joseph explained, a life debt had passed from Walking Bear to him, and from Thomas Carter to Ben. But the world outside wasn't just shaped by old debts. Joseph warned of white men moving through the territory, asking the wrong questions about Indian settlements, paying too much for information. These weren't government agents, he said, but men looking to create troublemen who would stir up violence for profit, then offer their services as Indian fighters to the highest bidder. Worse, they'd been asking about Ben, seeing him as a weak link, a white farmer who might be sympathetic to the Lakota. Joseph asked Ben to come to the Lakota settlement to meet the clan mother, Singing Crow Woman, and help them prepare for whatever was coming. The request weighed heavy. Ben couldn't just abandon his farm, his animals, the life he'd built with his late wife Sarah. But he knew, deep down, that the frontier didn't allow for half measures. If these men were planning violence, he couldn't stand aside. He agreed on the condition that he would only fight if it was purely defensive. Joseph nodded. That was all they wanted. The journey to the settlement took 2 days through deep snow. Ben secured his farm as best he could, leaving feed for his animals and hiding valuables. The Lakota community was larger than he'd expected. Sturdy cabins, hide lodges, children playing in the snow, and adults working together in the cold. He was greeted by Singing Crow Woman, Walking Bear's daughter, a figure of quiet authority. She welcomed Ben as the son of Thomas Carter, honoring the old debt and inviting him to a feast in memory of her father and Ben's. That night, Ben saw a different side of the Old West. The Lakota weren't the hostiles he'd heard about in town gossip, but families, storytellers, and survivors. Singing Crow Woman recounted how Thomas Carter had saved Walking Bear, refusing army bounties and risking his own safety. Ben felt pride and sorrow. His father had never told him these stories, but now he understood the legacy he carried. After the feast, the leaders gathered to discuss the threat. The so-called federal agents were planning to manufacture Indian raids, stealing cattle, attacking farms, leaving false evidence to justify a massacre. The Lakota needed Ben to be a witness, to help them prepare defenses and to speak to the authorities as a white man with a reputation for fairness. Ben agreed to try, knowing the risk. If he failed, he'd return to help defend the settlement. His journey to the territorial capital was a lesson in bureaucracy and disappointment. The administrator, Mills, dismissed Ben's warnings, insisting the agents were legitimate and that Indian raids were a real threat. Ben realized the system was rigged, protecting the interests of men like Mills, not the settlers or the Lakota. He returned to the settlement, determined to fight for the truth. While Ben was gone, The Lakota scouts had uncovered the full plan. The false agents would attack 3 isolated farms, killing the families and leaving Indian signs, then use the evidence to justify a punitive expedition against the settlement. Ben's own farm was one of the targets. The Lakota had a plan: warn the families, hide them for the night, and set a trap for the attackers. Ben rode out in the darkness, convincing the families to leave their homes and trust him. By dawn, everyone was safe, and the Lakota warriors were in position. That night, the attackers came, moving with military precision. They broke into Ben's farmhouse, finding only empty beds. Joseph and his warriors surrounded them, demanding surrender. The attackers claimed to be federal agents, but Sheriff Garrett, alerted by Ben, stepped from the shadows, badge gleaming. The law had come at last, and the false agents were arrested, their plot exposed. The aftermath was swift. The attackers were tried and convicted, their connections to corrupt officials revealed in newspapers across the territory. Mills resigned in disgrace, and the new administration issued a formal apology to the Lakota. Ben, once a solitary farmer, was now a bridge between worlds. He decided to build a trading post between his farm and the settlement, a place where Lakota and settlers could meet, trade, and learn from each other. Sitting by the fire with Singing Crow Woman, Ben reflected on how much had changed since that snowy night. He'd gained a new family, one that crossed the lines of race and history, bound by courage and honor. The circle of debt and kindness begun by his father was now complete. But the story was just beginning, Dot. If you enjoyed this journey through the heart of the Old West, where honor, danger, and redemption ride side by side, don't forget to like this video and ring that bell so you never miss another tale from the frontier. YouTube has been unsubscribing folks from this channel, so check right now to see if you're still following us. If not, hit subscribe and saddle up for more stories that bring the wild, untamed spirit of the West right to your screen. Let's see if you're still riding with us, partner. Until next time, keep your powder dry and your heart open for the next great adventure on the frontier.